Hello everyone, today we talk about Zhou warfare, and I know it sounds crazy given that it's 800 years of military history, so I'm not entirely sure I will call this the usual very short introduction because I'm making this series now about Chinese warfare in this kind of more compact fashion. I'm not sure whether I will eventually even descend. I will do it um, time allowing, but not I haven't scheduled it yet. I mean, something more precise about the various phases of this era rather than else as we see now, because you know that the Zhou Dynasty, yes, namely ruled between the 11th and the third century, but the actual changes within this time frame were enormous, right? It's more like an era with sub eras on their own. There are the Western Zoo, the Eastern Zoo, and in turn the latter divided between the spring and autumn annals phase and one of the warring states, and there is the emergence of the kin, kind of the Chinese Spartans, and later the Hans. At the end, the Zoo had become this kind of hypothesis of themselves. Also, the previous Shanks had that the Saint Zeus had overthrown kept existing for a while, and it's even difficult to look at China itself and saying, what is Chinese and what already at the time they called barbarians, right? Because it's not entirely clear, right? You know that China means literally everything under heaven, so they had naturally already their ecumenic, universal ideology connected to the imperial one, etc., the sacrality of the rule. But in practice, we're looking at very different set of peoples. Properly, they were different peoples with different ethnicities, different languages, different religions, right? And yes, and yet this is an interesting experience, I'd say, for me, because this is kind of the first time I'm addressing in a more or less serious way, or at least comprehensive fashion, Chinese warfare, the acknowledgement of how advanced China was at the time, compared also to Western warfare that we have seen mostly up to this point. So I think it can be interesting mostly from this 2 cents that I can give you about that in a comparative fashion that I believe is, the comparative and the diachronic method is the only one you can learn military history. It doesn't make any sense to study warfare by sticking, say, just to one specific time and place, because you will factually not understand what the art of war is broadly meant. Speaking of that, this is the same time, for example, of Sun Tzu, or whoever he was, or whoever they were, for that matter, and many other authors that also in this video I cannot really digress on, because we're talking about very important, altogether actually a very important body of military works that made up a real doctrine that was handed down generation after generation. Also, in fact, mixing a bit the cards, the same Sun Tzu actually was mixed with other authors. Just we figure out from 1972 discovering another manuscript that they were actually two different works there. But what we see here is really something seriously advanced that, again, is also comparatively to Western Eurasia is really mind-blowing in a sense, and as you understand, also easily more difficult to interpret in a sense. I will not digress also on the different Chinese mindset that does make things more complicated to interpret and properly to also, these are very archaic times in the first place, and yet very different from the ones that we're habituated also since Hellenic historiography from the 6th, the 5th century to interpret history like. So it's not entirely clear as far as we, especially as a military, so I'm very interested in the ratio between the various arms. In this case, chariots, infantry, cavalry especially, at the end of the period. And it's impossible to speak of a zoo warfare altogether, right? There are some common features, but at some point there are really different philosophies, tactics, and mindsets that this entire period encompasses, as I was saying at the beginning. And it's difficult to measure also the strength of these arms, because the battles that we know, I honestly don't know how far historiography has gone, because I have lots of stuff on Chinese warfare, also pretty updated one, but I know that these are fields in continuous expansion, and that also we have to be very, very careful every time we approach historiography, because I think academies are not really going towards the best directions, methodologically speaking, just for how the scientific production, as it's disgustingly called at this point, is, what the mechanics are behind that. But for what I've seen, again, it's not easy to measure the same value of infantry or cavalry as you could see from, I don't know, the starting from Hellenic historiography, especially in the West, etc. Also, the sources probably are more scattered. Our understanding of the Shang period, that is the one prior to the Zoo, is in part shrouded in mystery. You can say we actually know what the deal was, right? Was a warfare really taking shape, and the acceleration in the Zoo period is, especially in the latter years, in the 4th, 3rd centuries, really increasing fast. So at some point we will talk about the Qin, and obviously later we will talk about the Han, but again, there are all these sub-periods that we will see, especially the mid first millennium BC seems to have been an important turning point, but actually part of a broader pattern that was pretty much the same. And again, we have a pretty vague idea of how things began to change. We have, there's a bit of stereotyping involved along some patterns that are very interesting, because in part they do correspond to the Western ones, especially this transition from a kind of more late age of heroes, like a Bronze Age, and this essentially centrality of chariot warfare and the heroes, etc., and then eventually something more secular, modern, at least for compared to the prior periods that mostly has been attributed to the epoch of the warring states, that however that passed from this moment of increased brutality and intensity of warfare, which is probably true, but that would have allegedly unhinged the an otherwise chivalric code that was in vogue before. It's complex, we will see it now in some greater detail, but we do see rather this intensification of warfare also along, in fact, some kind of more professional, disciplined lines. The same doctrinal body that appears around the mid-century, including Sun Tzu, etc., seem to have been the result, in a sense, of this. You can palpate that concretely. There is the decline of chariot warfare towards the end of the period that is interesting, because, as you know, in the West we abandoned chariot warfare largely, at least earlier, but China is different, and there is this kind of feudal system that the Zoo, especially the Western zoos, since their come to power, seem to have installed, with some kind of very hierarchically, let's say, scanned idea of who were the top states, the nobility, and what troops they had to provide, and all these kind of things, so that there is something much more intensely feudal than we see in the West. At the same time, a dramatic development of the same infantry that, however, paradoxically, still by the mid-first millennium BC seems to have been surpassed by the centrality of the swordmen, right, and later also of cavalry, in a sense, which, as we'll see, there are some back and forths in later Chinese warfare, but it's fascinating because it speaks of an important infantry solidity with a kind of further, say, feudally professional and kind of equestrian revival after that, right? So it's something that can be even equated to a sort of as if the Zhou period contained a sort of medieval feudalism happening at some point, and then for other developments to take place. Another thing that I'm not going to digress on, and again, for this reason, I will have to make tons of videos. So I promise you I will do it, especially if you're interested in Chinese warfare, because it's really important and, of course, overlooked. And I think at this point in history, it's more important than ever to make this kind of comparisons, because it's a way also to bridge some gaps and distances in a way that maybe can hopefully make communist China turning into something more, civilized and decent morally and scientifically. And I think that history can do that, right? If we really start studying each other's history, we can, break that fanatic ideologism that lays at the root of Chinese, frankly, pure racism. There is hardly, aside from the disgust of communism in all its forms, but properly the hand racism and ethnocentrism of the Chinese regime that is one of the single most disgusting pages in the history of mankind, aside from the utter and appalling, several tens of millions of people eliminated for sheer cultural backwardness, because that's fundamentally what communism substantiates itself in, right? Whereas China has this previous past that is something completely different, that the same communism has in an equally disgustingly fashion destroyed. I mean, the communists at some point realized the mistake, because also there is hope for any stupid person. They tried to reconstruct the thing they had destroyed from the past, trying to dispatch it from real. These are the levels of backwardness we're talking about, really. And, this immense tragedy, unfortunately, is still under our eyes, and the consequences of communism in all its forms. But again, I do think in the humanity, so in the, humanity as anti-communism by definition, right? And the cultural value of history to substantiate, China's emptied culture, emptied of one of the most fascinating, beautiful cultures in the history of mankind, to improve humanly, like as literal human beings, so not like bots or, whatever they have really transformed them into. And albeit this is mostly something that we can use also as competitors, meaning that knowing our enemy is a way naturally to topple them. And this is and knowing history is everything there, because if you know history, you know how as easily you can get mistaken about some of the simplest things that if you just open a history book you would know. Just like look at what Russia has done. I mean, if the preconditions weren't the ones they were, they would have never done that. And that's of course for the complete absence of any historical or cultural awareness. But in any case, the Zhou Dynasty is, can be approached even in a small video like this, and I will try to make it. Some of you joke because when I say this, I make 2 hours long videos, but frankly, there's no other way. You can make the cheap stuff. You could avoid some of my rambles just right now, but at the same time, we must get ourselves pretty honest with each other about why this is necessary and why there is no alternative scientifically nor morally. So I will skip many things, of course, lots of also the important ones we know, because otherwise I would really never end. I will get into details in other videos. So the emergence of the Zhou Dynasty is fascinating because, first of all, it opens to this other issue of the origin of the same Chinese civilization. Some have connected it even to the Aryan migrations, right? The Indo-European pressure from the steppe. After all, the same chariot warfare stems from there. And there are doubts, in fact, about the early dynasties, the Xias, for example. We're talking about much before the 18th century BC, and then the Shangs, and the Zhous have been influenced, maybe originally, by some of these movements. In any case, that technology came from there. Chinese tradition says something different, that, they were autochthonous, at least. Of course, the peoples were, right? Shanks may have adopted the chariot, war chariot from the steppe people, because that's how it happened. But of course, there were locals that were absorbing that as well. But there is also a degree of mix, because as we were saying before, the so-called barbarians, how the Chinese called them, could be in a very way many, right? It's like in ancient Greece, like the Boeotians were barely, considered Hellenes, but at that point it was yet a much wider world outside, and the Zhou were in a sense a hybrid, right? Kind of in their warfare we see it kind of a compromise between the Shang and the steppes. They had seemingly more chariots and more horses than them. Cavalry, meant properly as horsemanship for war, was not prevalent at this, but throughout most of this period till the last centuries, chariot dominated, and cavalry was like the time of our Bronze Age warfare. I mean, it was there, it had some role, but it was secondary, and eventually would gain steam instead. This may have had to do with, generally speaking, also the demographic pool of China. As we will see, infantry and the peasantry were very important. So the difference in balance between the various arms is due also to the fact that probably the infantry masses had a much greater weight than other areas in the world, not necessarily because they were more qualitative, but there are questions also about this, I will see now, and there is in fact a historiographical debate as far as I know, because sometimes it's even a problem of translations. You see, you need I don't know Chinese and really nothing about it, so even for the pronunciation here, I will butcher many names, but it's not even a problem, because frankly everybody kind of has their system of reference. In any case, they didn't speak anything that can be, by the rules of which can phonetically be strictly referred to modern Chinese. So it's a relative problem. But what I was talking about, as always, is the problem of not being an expert linguistically and philologically in the original languages when you study history. And that can lead to mistranslations that can really alter a lot of our understanding, especially of the organization system, which the Chinese wrote about. And this is the interesting thing about that as I was saying before, there's literally a doctrinal body of military notions. Everybody knows Sun Tzu, and we will talk about that later, but there's really an astonishing amount of stuff beyond that that also criticizes the art of war and adds to something. Also the same Sun Tzu, as you know, we even doubt that he existed as a single person. It was just a sum of knowledge, of wisdoms. It's also it's essentially a Taoist military view, worldview in a sense, not much of something as we could interpret in more modern and rational ways. So that I already made a video between talking about the obvious difference between Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz, right? But since there are plenty of imbeciles today that think that studying Sun Tzu makes you a strategist, and they have neither studied von Clausewitz, there are gigantic educational works that we have to make in our own world, right, before even descending in some more subtle issues. But that's definitely a read that you should make. So this took over traditionally in the 11th century, and the archaeological finds do suggest a great cultural history of the Shang. Wu's military system was in part, of course, adopted by the same Zhous, right? Also the kind of almost mythical Xia dynasty seems to have had naturally something about that, but mostly we are connected to the writing that emerged only at a certain point in the Shanks, and that therefore also developed further to make us only at a certain point satisfied, let's say, about some military historical information. later on, right? In fact, it's only when we get to great historians like Sima Qian that we can start talking about history in a somewhat decent sense, always bearing in mind that the difference between, let's say, myth and history sometimes is always blurred in such archaic times as well. So, in a sense, the Zhou begin Chinese history. And exactly when or why they descended from the Shaanxi and Gansu of the Sichuan plain is not known. It may have been a result of a domino effect, as we were saying before, originating, movement originating in even in Western Asia, not even just Central Asia, by the Indo-Europeans, right? But as you were saying before, Chinese do not really, at least Chinese tradition doesn't see it that way. I think it's possible, by the way, because still, again, China was huge demographically already at the time. It passed from this period from something like 16 million to 40 million inhabitants, right? So it's really, it was really a big thing. The major Indo-European movements were mostly towards the west, and as you know, also in India, the Veda, they didn't even leave an archaeological trace, but traditionally it's there. Instead, China may have swallowed the entire thing because it was even larger, and there was less contact with the original sea of the city of the Indo-Europeans. So it would be completely normal if we had no trace of that historically or archaeologically, even just, broadly speaking, traditionally or anthropologically. And until we learn more, the Zhou will thus remain a bit like the Shang, still a mystery. What we know, however, is that within 20 years, the Zhou, according to stories, conquered all of the Shang territory, including 50 states. There was still the Shangs kept living on, right? And the system was, in a sense, immediately compromised because the Zhous redistributed all these states and also in the internal system, the land, in something that traditionally has been kind of identified more like feudalism. And so with this decentralized system that, as you know, is not really the top recipe for establishing a central government on the long run. But initially things went, let's say, the Zhous were, as a dynasty, were recognized as the rulers. Various states always escaped, of course, their control, but liege lords paid tribute to the king, and so everything was relatively stable as it could happen for the time. The big break occurred starting, however, from a coup in 841, and in 771, especially the Jung barbarians took over the ancestral Zhou lands. The capital Hao was sacked, and so even though these were in the west, so even though the city was and the entire territory were recaptured shortly afterwards, they would be the system would be shattered and divided, so that even if in 750 everything was namely informally reunited, according to this the ideal model, we start talking about the Eastern Zhou period, that instead is is a moment where other states alternatively, and it's an extremely complicated history also because it's a very long one, emerged at various times, exercising some hegemony, etc., and the Zhou were essentially confined in an ever smaller space till the end. And this the Eastern, so we distinguish between Western Zhou from 1027 BC to 771, and the Eastern Zhou period from 771 to effectively the end, if I'm not wrong. I mean, later on, other powers emerged where the Zeus was still there, and now historiographically you can also call this, in fact, as other periods. However, the Eastern Zhou period is, as we were saying before, divided again between 771, 479, and the later period up to the 3rd century, that are respectively the period of spring and autumn, that were, this is what was called because of the content of the Annals State of Lu, that tells us basically all the stories that occurred from 771 to 479, and then the Warring States period, the latter, and the difference being, in theory, this kind of difference between the previous chivalric, let's say, period and ruthless discipline, albeit of the latter, albeit the original one was also kind of idealistic. It's a bit like in medieval Europe, the idea that there was at some point a sort of chivalry that had also, just ideally because of the more primitive background, kind of idealistic system that had kept things together, where the idea of loyalty and faith and this kind of sense of as if there had been rules that managed to do warfare had been disrupted by victories like, I don't know, the one of the commoners at Courtrai, etc. And there is objectively a difference that we can spot, in fact, around the middle of this period, 500 BC, right? The 6th century seems to have changed big deal things because indeed China was developing, and as such, something that was more, let's say, state-alike and more meritocratic, with generals that started emerging also from the peasantry, in a brutally oligarchic system. Still, there was no such thing like equality, but I mean the development of urban centers, the land exploitation, expansion put a lot of pressure on various states. Surely increased the efforts, the statal capacities, in fact, the creation of more professional systems. But it's a bit in the same medieval times. This is what basically I have seen it like, even though it's not the same, obviously, but it's like a bit saying in the Middle Ages, where there is a refeudalization at the end of the period, when you have, I don't know, armies like the ones of the square pikemen, etc., that are not at all a development of the commoner power, etc. They are just essentially proletarians under the ruthless and firm control of sound princely states that also exalt themselves in a kind of a still essentially feudal fashion, a dynastic fashion. So there are lots of backs and forths that we can't properly trace entirely, and I got this latter idea because essentially what you see is that chariot warfare declines. And in the West, this happened because of the development of infantry, which is the same thing that seems to have occurred during the Warring States period, albeit it's, as we were saying before, the same period in which you see that the centrality of for example, of the horsemen, passes from a charioteer to properly a mounted fighter, and I don't know, there are swords that are literally coming around, passing from the older daggers, etc., and something longer and kind of more also suited for mounted combat. And as we will see, there are these dagger axes, because would be progenitors of halberds in a sense. They were very sophisticated weapons, but they get surpassed. So those were for infantry, large formations, get surpassed by the guy with the sword and the shield. Right, that is also usually a nobleman, right? So in theory, in the previous period, instead, the one of the spring and autumn, you would have the set of rules for which you didn't have to attack a country while its leader had just died, or that all kind of niceries about how warriors should have fought. And we know actually from the beginning that this was not true, because we have evidence of ruthless command, of people being killed when disciplined and forced at a collective level against also warrioristic individualism. We know of tricks or ruses, etc., which are already well developed since the times. Even, I don't know, the Art of War talks about that, so that the same Taoists complain about it because there are these ruses and traps, etc., that are exalted, and we know evidently that the system had already developed from before. It's a bit like in medieval times. We think that there is chivalry because there is let's say a class that fabricates that, and really nobody writes anything different because simply the community has not developed enough. So we think that since somebody elitistically and idealistically wrote about chivalry, this kind of existed more before than in later times, and as if especially the earlier was about being fair, not using tricks and things like that. But when we actually try to see what was the opinion of the men who actually fought at the time, which they usually didn't write either, you see that there is no trace of that. There is the sense, yes, of course, of fairness and the way war should have been done, where a true warrior face-to-face fighting should have been about. But, there is no evidence that the reality was ever less, violent or ruthless or unloyal, let's say, than it was later, right? It's rather the intensification of warfare that kind of crumbles a habit that was intrinsic mechanically in the dynamics of warfare of the early days that were probably also more seasonal and less intense, etc. And then eventually instead start also the period of the warring states, as the name is quite eloquent, right? There is an ever greater mobilization of troops. It seems armies enlarged. That's also another very interesting aspect of Chinese warfare at this point, because you see that, I don't know, even Sun Tzu's considered, 100,000 men armies to be the norm, right? What does that mean? Because, if you launch the invasion of a country, yes, you can have separate armies that operate independently, and it's possible considering also the extension of the states, but not because they were commanded individually in a single battle, right? It's impossible for the logistics of the time, for the chain of command, the technology to maintain an effective armored force of more than, it would be a miracle if it had been 50,000 in a battle, in an open, in a pitched battle. It's absurd to think more than that. Whereas in the previous period, numbers say 30,000, right? And so everybody says, but if many treatises stressed later that 30,000 is inadequate, it has to pass to 100,000. Then Sun Tzu, for example, also lists all the costs of this in detail, etc. It seems like, maybe there were really 100,000. The question is, again, that there are many other questions that have to be answered there about what this 100,000 were there to do, and also how still we don't know that this is an exaggeration. The texts are very just are summas of sayings, of mottos. They're more than else, right? So this doesn't mean that they are necessarily wrong. We were talking about the first millennium BC, right? We were talking about a level, probably also philosophical development, that was extremely different and much simpler than today. So, do not ever think that we know better than them, but let's understand that they had reasons to say certain things. In fact, for reasons that we don't see now, for which we don't have to believe literally everything that was meant if we don't understand the function that these works really had, right? So that's another issue. Let's say that in 771 BC, as we were saying before, there was this important change due also to this continuous presence of the barbarians in the frontier areas of China that were used by Chinese rulers. The one of the Duke of Shen specifically employing Xiongnu mercenaries, overthrowing the Zhou government and killing the king, right, from the original from the ancestral lands. So this broke the system until the end of the Zhou and the unification of the empire under the Qin. China was reduced to principalities under a feudal system with much more power laying, especially in the northern states. Even though sometimes southern warfare was ever more brutal, right, than the latter, especially in terms of coercive capacities on the masses, and consequently also the sheer amount of dead people. Southern warfare was one of the single most brutal chapters in the history of mankind. And in comparison, also the northern Zhou one was like kind of, much more. They're really, chivalric in a way. Literally, peasants taken like as if they were nothing and simply thrown in the meat grinder, like, with creating entire areas of China covered in corpses. Right? I'm not kidding about this. This is what they would literally do. In any case, and this is a bit the idea of the north that is a bit tougher because it's closer to the barbarians, whereas in the south, also because of the gentler weather, there's more masses, but they're kind of more kind of weaker, right? More defenseless, but brought down to be just butchered, as they were not particularly warlike in a sense, but this is also a stereotype on its own, right? So the spirit of the Middle or Eastern Zhou that follows, so important cultural development. It's the moment in which Kung Fu Zhou, that is Confucius, lived, the great sage. It's the time of the 5 classics, the Book of Tao, the 4 books of philosophy, the Sun Tzu, the Art of War. So, as you understand, an important also literary revival that shows us a more advanced and less kind of mythological and just in fact magical dimension, that this history that emerges from the fogs, the unknown fogs of time. The period of the warring states, instead, between the 480 and 2021 BC, saw the growth of strong states such as the Ku in the lower Yangtze Valley, and the dynamic state of the Qin, as we were saying before, the north and the west. And the Qin were really raw and brutal. They had this essentially completely militarized state that was based on pure merit, where the entire hierarchy of command was and promotion system was exclusively based on the number of severed heads that you would take from the enemy on the battlefield. And this thing, as we will see probably in another video, was terrifying and put an ultimate end to the Zhou Dynasty that de facto, however, had already dissolved in power centuries before. It was still attributed an important charisma and role and authority, but just on bamboo, given that paper, or even not even in China, existed at this time yet. In fact, consider that also these enormous treatises that were written were, enormous, maybe not much, but considering they had to be written on bamboo leaves that were put together to form pages and connected by leather, right? So just even to bring the Sun Tzu Art of War around, you should have pulled this, cart literally loaded with this enormous roll of bamboo. Just it would have been enough to write the entire work, right? So, of course, people at that time had a dramatically more developed memory than most people today can even dare to dream of. But that also tells how, in a sense, different our, the process of knowledge making and preservation was really also for us to relate with it today and, interpreting it through our mental categories. So speaking of the Zhou military organization, there is really a lot that you can get from Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Right, there is really a lot about military organization, tactics. As you know, there is all a criticism that is the same one you can say today. The entire work is permeated with the sense of it's a mix of in Clausewitzian terms of what it would be political and military at the same time. There are some dictamina that would like to aim at the concept that you would just to defeat your enemy without fighting, which is obvious if you reason politically, but if you are talking military in a strict sense, you miss entirely the point. So that's the main problem with Sun Tzu, that says things that are also obviously the consequence of his own times, like never besiege a city. But right, it's obvious that if you understand the fact that most of their armies were loaded in heavy chariots that had an enormous logistics, etc., but being bogged down in a siege was an enormous cost. And so the perfect general would have been the one that managed to understand everything before and winning just the sole thought, which is a very Taoistic idea, of this essence that underlays reality, etc. But again, it's not a real thing. On the other hand, you have a lot of other insights that Sun Tzu, or Wu for him, many authors probably over the centuries, added that is very practical, right? They're just a bit of, a very insightful list of notions that, however, are not really meant to be patched together per se. Other than, and we can't even think, of course, that, say, Zhou warfare was actually about this, right? It's just like in antiquity. It's not before the modern age that we began to write military theory with the purpose of having a positive application of the same. But I don't know, if you read something like, there's a passage from Sun Tzu in the note in chapter 5, section 31, that says never surround an enemy without giving him a possibility of escape. Because otherwise it's as if you would corner a tiger. Or the same thing would say basically Julius Caesar half of a millennium later in one of his writings. So warfare, of course, is universal and has always the same meaning, the same dynamic. Warfare is always the same in every single age. It never changes, ever, right? And so this idea that, of course, they understood much more intelligently than us at this time, thinking that warfare is changed by technology, say, per se, or that something else, is it's something that should be recovered properly in order to understand both strategic education and the military art concretely are, but also you should contextualize them historically in the same ways at ports. The art of war is normally dated to the 4th century, but it seems that was, if not already around, but as a body of notions, and wherever you think that this possibly fictional character of Sun Tzu lived, it was around it was 1 century before, roughly, around 500 BC. In any case, of course, there is a lot of information about how soldiers fought, etc. And the interest of the art of war is that it was maintained as a work for other military critics to add later their own comments on the applications of the principles that were listed. So giving further flavor, if you want, with through their same critique, with insights, etc. As we'll see now, centrality in Zhou warfare was the quadriga, the 4-horse war chariot. The Shanks had already had it back in the day, but the most common one was the lighter 2 horses type. So what you realize is that already there is an increase really of in the weight of chariot not very differently in timeline if you think about it from the West, right? But in a sense, apparently in a more consistent fashion, probably showing how infantry was more important in China. Again, perhaps because more of quantity and also material wealth necessary than some cohesion like the one we could have in the West with the Sea peoples that were much more barbarian, probably kind of more morally loaded in a way. And this idea that the chariot was meant probably also to smash into infantry, and much more than that, because it seems that these Chinese armies were huge, and naturally chariots fought mostly against other chariots, but it was an important armed interaction. You will see now that we can also partly reconstruct from a tactical point of view. The infantry served in this regard as a mere support of the main shock weapon in the form of the chariot. And it's only late Zhou times that cavalry comes to play a consistent role, right, in properly as a shock weapon, and more practically, and eventually putting the chariot warfare not to an end, because in China it also continued for a longer time than the West, as it happened elsewhere. For example, in India, right? While Mediterranean and the European warfare had basically seen the end of chariot warfare, and also not in the larger ways. There were still, in China, in India, there was an important use of these systems. And consider that in China, there weren't, there actually were elephants, but they didn't have, there was not such a thing like an elephant warfare developed like in India, right? Elephants seem to have been actually ridden into battle like in India during the Shang period. There is evidence of, because elephants still existed in India at the time, like rhinos, for example, up to the first, the second half of the first millennium BC, they used them to make hides, also for armor and leather, etc. And in the latter period, however, they seem just to have been used like more like in the Western fashion, like just for this trail of elephants launched as a charge, but never elephant warfare was prominent in Chinese warfare ever, because simply elephants were a few, and we see that chariot warfare and even infantry warfare were always more important than that. There's also debate regarding the amount of missiles that we will talk about more thoroughly later. It seems that archers may have been the most common type of infantry during the Shang period, whereas during the Zhou one we would seemingly don't have the same thing, but also we have a very important missile warfare development, not just with the longbow. It was somewhat traditional, or at least it was present, as you know, not as a type per se, but there was a specialized use of the people that were larger and could use it. Also with an interesting combination, we'll see now, also literally for the size of human beings compared to the infantry, but especially the crossbow that starts appearing from the mid millennium BC. Again, that's the turning point where the most interesting things seem not to have began, but to have started accelerating further. The Chariot Unit, according to the Li Qi, that is a book of rites, and also Sima Fa, so we're talking about around 700 BC, consisted of the main vehicle, foot soldiers, and attendants. Now, because of some mistranslations, we don't understand exactly, according to these works, whether the basic unit was fundamentally made up of the 3 charioteers plus 75 infantry and 72 infantry and 25 attendants, or there was some other difference. This is probably the most likely one, because some have mistranslated, probably thinking that the 25 were some kind of still fighting men, probably with the difference in armor compared to other 72. I mean, the whole unit would make 100. You see the 3 charioteers, then 25 attendants, and the remaining 72 men. So the best translation would probably be, again, 3 charioteers with this 25 attendants that were probably for the same charioteers themselves, as these were the top guys, right? They were also the nobility of some form, plus 75, actually again 72 foot soldiers to support the chariot. The attendants would have possibly also been just to watch the baggage cart, but as we know also from other times in history, very often the baggage cart was left somewhere at some point. There might have been some, and these various troop units very often were brigaded together, separated, right? That is to say, all the infantry was deployed from one side, not necessarily in a single line when they had in the front their own masters, their own charioteers. This is especially evident when we consider missile troops, perhaps. And I have an idea that, however, doesn't seem to be supported by any of these works, that there may have been a very, let's say, a very sophisticated interaction between chariots, missiles, and infantry. I may be influenced by my 13th, 14th century AD Western European warfare studies to think that the missiles might have been deployed on the sides to kind of target the charioteers in between. Consider that here we're talking about big numbers, but all warfare, we already know it, independently from what sources leave us, is always fought also by much smaller contingents. So also the development of crossbow later, that was not necessarily more effective than longbow at the time. We don't know, but this may be a bit like the gastrafetes in the Mediterranean at the same time. It was not really more powerful than the bow, seemingly, albeit it's very difficult to reconstruct, but it was more effective at closer range. May mean, anyhow, that there was an increased need for missile that, in fact, the same authors tell us were dramatically effective against the chariots, right? And if you want to really target the chariots at that point, you don't want to have your missile troops just behind the chariots, your own chariots, so that you can't target the enemy. Apparently, there was something very medieval in this tactics. That is to say, the charioteers would, as we'll see now with the tactics, go back and forth, right, clashing against one another, coming back and going to war again. Very, very seigneurial, very feudal in a way, with the other troops replenishing them with arms, giving them to drink something. So at that point, of course, there should have been a screen of some sort of infantrymen with also especially missile troops behind, which is witnessed, in fact, because it says that longbowmen very often were taller than the pikemen in the front. But so that this may, at least we don't know, but it may have facilitated the shot there, and that would have protected the entire unit, from possible chariot charges, etc. But another possibility is that naturally the missile comforted the chariots fighting by shooting, like in a crossfire, the corridor from the sides, the corridor where the chariots fought one against the other. So we don't know, because the broader organization speaks of larger bodies of troops, at least what the treatises say, that fit with very large numbers. We will see now in a while. We know that infantry was equipped normally with, it wasn't particularly heavy per se. And this is obvious if we look at the very early times. We compare also how, Western troops were, was an extremely primitive world. And there is a source suggesting that the only armor allocated to this footmen was in the form of a shield sometimes. Probably in those 72 men behind the chariot, there was some sort of segmentation for what concerns the equipment, and probably some sort of tactical specialization in terms of the armament. And it's obvious that normally the first troops, like this is also what Xenophon says, were the best equipped, the others would follow, etc. They were the ones that held the front and were more skilled and coped, and the others had to simply stick to them. And speaking of the organization, however, there were, as you understand, in a largely feudal system, some sort of household units being provided by the sovereign as a guard, fundamentally, to every higher ranking officer or dignitary for ruling the land. And there was also some statal administration, but fundamentally was, again, essentially feudal system. The relation with the land was crucial. The Zhou sovereign traditionally would have had a guard of 2,500 infantry, known as Shi, while each higher ranking officer would have a guard of 500 men, known as Lu, right? And in the later years of the Spring and Autumn Annals period, we know that that there was a greater formalization of this system into, again, something that resembled more of larger armies on a systemic base, so that Shi and Lu-sized units would prevail as the core arrangement. In fact, the typical army would be made up of 6 Shi, which is 15,000 men, and the core unit being 500, right? Some sort of division with this various regiments within. So, as we were saying before, the ideal army of the late Zhou especially would count something like 1,000 war chariots and 100,000 infantry. So it's the idea that we were saying before, 1 chariot for 100 men, right? Traditionally considered that the nobility fighting on chariots was meant also to fight on foot. In fact, the aforementioned guards were infantry, right? So probably that it would make this last stand. We're told that infantry could be deployed also as the center of the army sometimes, probably with the chariots maybe in another position laterally. Other times, probably more often, the chariots were always in the front, right, and the infantry would follow. But there were different types of formations, of course, the understanding of which, however, is very difficult given the information at our disposal. This idea of the 100,000, as we've seen, is ridiculous. It doesn't mean anything. It's obvious considering the smaller organic units that armies were much smaller just per se, right? And that the ideal of perfection, of universal completion, etc., of the 100, the decimal system, 1,000, 100,000 is just there for us to say, okay, this is not really the case. So this is really for any other country in the world. Like, you have these exaggerations in any other context that we know that things were really different. An additional 1,000 light chariot in this 100,000 would have been used for reconnaissance work, and it would consist of the older type with less, in fact, lighter chariots with less horses and especially less crew, consisting just of driver and bowman. That also tells you how, of course, which is necessary in every army in the first place, but it stresses also how in the sources there was need to add, that extra imperfect element just to the round cipher, let's say. As we were saying before, it's possible, as we have information also, for example, at the Battle of Maling, that various kin units like infantry and skirmishers, chariots, etc., were brigaded together, right? The Battle of Maling is known mostly for the ruse that the general carried out there by showing the enemy that the troops were ever less, because every day as if they were deserting, because he had ordered to make ever less fires for the cooking, and he attracted the enemy in a pass, and there was full of crossbows that cut the enemy down. So this would make me suggest the aforementioned system of actually a much smaller armies, of course, but very intensely drilled, especially at this time. That case, that commanders you'll see now is particularly famous. But the idea is obvious, right? They had all these means. They could essentially invest ever more in qualitative arm synergy to maximize the effects of all their means, of all their arms, in fact. And the introduction of massed crossbows that happened exactly at the Battle of Maling in Chinese warfare seemed to have caused a phasing out of chariots from Chinese warfare, right? As the Sun Tzu states also that crossbows were able to put chariots out of business. Which, however, is something that, again, was evidently happening before. So also these crossbows were older, and at that point it was all a time, say, to develop their employment. Just like in medieval Europe, the crossbows never disappeared from ancient history into the Middle Ages. They were always there. You find them even, I don't know, in Scotland during the 7th century. It's just that the type of properly the amount of materials and training was needed to create large numbers of commoners that could, again, would become at that point even professionals of some regard, was not there, right, for maximize the use of crossbow in a battle. And thus the employment was all more scattered. It's only by the 14th century you have really 13th, 14th century, this masses of thousands of crossbowmen really pouring out hell of quarrels over the enemy. With all the technology that had just developed further in the previous centuries, albeit the crossbow, again, had always existed. Right, so again, as always, technology without doctrine does not exist. Practically has virtually no meaning or significance or consistency. So again, we have to read beyond the crossbow came around. No, it's just that these armies were ever more drilled so that they could make these fake routes. They could last for a long time with less food. They could really organize this whole thing. And the same crossbowmen at that point were not just the simple retinue again of a lord that had some of them together in their 100, right? They were now brought all together to fight collectively, right? Your collective training. So again, that's the immense thing, and you can argue that they would do the same in open field, probably against chariots. So maximizing, in a sense, their function, and given that the chariot was so central, probably really flanking it, right? I don't know whether there is any evidence of infantry wings at that time, but it's been pointed out that it couldn't be very different from something you see like with the longbow during the 100 Years' War, right? That is able to bog down eventually cavalry charges, right? Not stopping them, but still, having that role. Of course, this is not the case because the chariot and cavalry remained there, so it was not an all infantry system. But just to make you understand how probably we just see the tip of the iceberg here, and there is much more to know at the time of a dramatically intense warfare that, again, wouldn't really make me surprised if it showed these features that just didn't arrive to us, but would have been probably normal at the time because everything was increasingly and more maximally functionalized, right? So tactically, of course, the chariot was employed as the main shock weapon, right? These horses place really little emphasis on the infantry, and this may be a feudal bias of some sort. As we've seen, the Zhou had these liege lords that drove the chariots, right? And when the chariots fell back, the infantry protected them. Again, how this concretely happened, we don't know, but there are some similarities that we can see, especially not much for Bronze Age chariot warfare in parallel, but rather from early high medieval European practices. And I stress this also because it seems to me that Chinese chariot warfare relied on heavier chariots than the one we see maximally functionalized in the West during the Bronze Age. During the Bronze Age, you have pretty light chariots that were used to performing in columns. I made a video about Bronze Age warfare recently. Kind of a caracol, right? With the line defining in front of the enemy coming back and relining up, right? Before eventually regrouping and launching the final charge when the enemy was softened up enough, because through that continuous thing they could have a rate of fire that was concentrated on a single file front, like, I don't know, higher than a M2 heavy machine gun today, and not in power but in rate of fire. But in Chinese warfare you see that and so those chariots were very light. They get heavier at this point, and in fact this is the first millennium BC. Also in the West, chariots will become heavier, but Chinese chariots were very bulky, very heavy. They were much less agile, right? And it seems in fact that the entire tactics was much more shock oriented rather than skirmishing oriented, because they still had bowmen like in the West on the chariots, right? But seemingly the moment of the charge and the heaviness, the bulkiness, we'll see now how chariots were made, was much greater, right? And it would remain like that. And the mass charge of the chariots especially also had this important role. Also psychologically, they made a terrible noise, frightening, etc. There was probably something there coming in flavor coming from the steppes, right? This kind of idea of a greater, more barbarian-like, let's say, way of thinking this, as opposed to some more refined, I don't know, Egyptian style chariot interaction. Maybe just a forced comparison, but that's the idea that have received from that. And consider again that despite chariot warfare would decline further, and again the 5th century is more or less the one also in which in the West chariot, talking about the Achaemenid period, yes, they were there, as you know. Also Gaugamela was full of chariots from the Achaemenid side, but in the West we had completely abandoned them, aside from, I don't know, Northern Europe or North Africa that had remained a bit more primitive, but they had chariots, but weren't so bulky, right? Whereas we have up to the 2nd century, 3rd century BC, the Seleucids using, especially for the open plains of Syria, like saying chariot warfare had been a thing for a long time, these very bulky chariots that didn't have any of the previous agility, but it were just this massive pieces of wood and metal with sided wheels, in fact, just like in China existed, especially in the later period with bronze sides, etc. They were launched against infantry formation, hoping they would break even just before impact because of the sheer deterrence presented by that. Well, in China it seems that this thing continued more, right? I don't have a quantitative evidence to say that. We can probably get more thoroughly in that, but say the chariot continued a little bit more. And there is this other idea, in fact, that China is also huge, it's geographically complicated, but the idea is in fact that chariot warfare was not declining much just because of any technical issue per se, but also that the states, a bit like during the Peloponnesian War, had began gradually to go fight in ever more impervious areas. That it wasn't in fact, the originally, I don't know, spring and autumn period kind of chivalric meeting, where massive armies would, like in medieval Europe, would find the best ground for cavalry clashes, so a flat ground, right? So what ideal for chariots, right? Gradually things would complicate, right? And just like in Greece, the phalanx was central, there eventually skirmishers and cavalry begin to come about as soon as they move further, right? Because the states were becoming more enterprising in a sense. They were projecting on an ever larger scale. This is so they needed some type of troops that were more flexible for any circumstance. And so this seems to me also the reason why it happened. But given that China also has this massive river valleys and concentrated power and open plains, for doing that, it's possible that, again, in the centers of power, chariotry remained more central, let's say, compared to the West, right? That has a more complicated geography, let's put it in this way, than China, right? And this would inform, in general, also the entire Chinese culture and the empire and the celestial, the Blue River, the Yellow River, such that in the long run would kind of also sclerotize China into those basins to remain kind of concluded within itself, whereas in Europe we actually don't have a single basin, and this kind of complicated thing is probably for the better of our civilization. There was indeed a code of engagement between chariots, ideal. Because again, everything was considered as a sacred clash of some sort. This was still the age of heroes. The chariots of the zoo were, as the medieval knight, the main shock element. The infantry merely served to support their masters, and these masters were the ones who paid the functionaries and the administrators and the historians at the end of the day. So infantry kind of wasn't particularly appreciated. Probably there was some sort of ferocious class discrimination in that regard. But there are also hints throughout all this, first of all, as we'll see now, not only on the importance of infantry, but also on the one that culturally still was maintained. And there was a saying in Chinese at the time that went more or less this way, that the army was kind of water contained under the land, meaning stressing how the power of sovereigns was still concluded on the base of the peasant participation, right? That provided with the bulk, after all, numerically of the men and of the participation. We know that in the Zhou period, still also in very advanced times, was very important for the local lords to test the loyalty of the peasantry, because really without the support of the masses, there couldn't be also kind of a real war. And this was important. Also, Sun Tzu stresses, I don't know, you have to invade a country because that also blocks the levying, the recruitment system. It's the mass of the infantry was considered as something necessary for waging war, and striking at it was obvious. Also, of course, the agricultural resources were everything for the same system to be maintained. But the people were also counted in the system, because otherwise you could have not had those numbers in a system of 100, like of one chariot and 100 people, without naming other cavalry. Let's say infantry is important, right? Just it tells you maybe how ferocious the elite was, and how warrioristically obsessed about these ideals in a sense also was. And that's why maybe we get that individualistic kind of chivalric code in theory. And it's no surprise, maybe exactly in this regard, that as the in medieval Europe, eventually cavalry and knighthood was put in crisis by the revival of infantry. So in Zhou times, the deadly crossbow seems to have been really, as an infantry weapon, also a kind of anti-nobiliar one, right? And this would alter the balance, in fact, in both eras in the same way, at least on the battlefields. Not because the people ever counted anything for that matter. We have a few hints of some important infantry development that is attributed to some of the finest commanders of the time. For example, Wu Qi and the Marquis Wen of Wei. So we are around the beginning of the 4th century BC. In these cases, these were the Wu Qi was considered as a bloodthirsty warmonger by a certain degree, because he knew how to make war pretty well and would pursue his objectives unscrupulously. He had probably a lot of political enemies, and during him there is no surprise that there is the issue for infantry of long spears, halberds, bows, and crossbows. The footmen underwent much training in maneuver and tactics, so they could be used in great effect in battle. This seems to equate really to much of what we see in infantry development in medieval times as well. That is to say, infantry was always secondary to cavalry and especially to the nobility on the field. But this increase of combined arms, especially pikes, halberds, bows, crossbows, hell, this is what happens at the peak of medieval civilization in Europe between the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th century, right? And especially the presence of pikes that really take a lot of collective training to be used effectively. As we will see, some of them were very long. Also, we will see now the development of halberds that became ever more sophisticated from the original called Dagger Axe into something really that had essentially a tribal or even fourfold function that required a lot of skill and training to be employed, even though originally, again, the primitive weapon was very common already among the infantry altogether. And also important missile fire. Again, there is no other way but seeing this in a not necessarily just in an opposition against cavalry, because we don't have, again, any evidence of the fact that the commoners ever took over. On the contrary, with a full integration of the various arms, right? So that these systems were really advanced and not just something very primitive like in the Bronze Age kind of idea that the chariots are in the front, they do everything, and infantry just follows to fill the gaps created in the enemy units. No, this stuff at the end of the period seems to be really very advanced and unlike anything probably that we've ever seen in the West at the same time. And again, that reminds me dramatically of medieval warfare, right? I must say, I made a video about the Karakita by the 12th century AD. It's a completely different situation, but even there I was shocked by seeing how these Mongols essentially still, they were Sinicized, there is no doubt, but they still had this dramatic infantry support, and they were able to integrate it with their own essentially nomadic tactics as well. So Chinese warfare really requires a great deal of attention in this period, for sure. Sun Tzu tells us much of the Chinese soldiers. It seems that little, however, is mentioned of any training prior to the aforementioned Wu Qi in the year 387. That would be the one of the reform of this great commander that was very much, again, criticized but remained famous also for the ruthless means, because the idea was also that bravery was praised over discipline, and things started to change, where a bit like in Roman times, where the idea is that you are the hero, you can be the hero, the warrior, etc., but discipline is more important than that, because those who command at the top are superior to you in any way, and so if you disobey, you are destroying the system, you have to be put to death. and so as it would happen. So this ferocious discipline was necessary, in a sense, to emerge also in this brutally, troubled system, and it would emerge further with the Qin and the Han later on. And again, the fact that before that time we don't really have any information on infantry training doesn't really matter that it was not there. Also in medieval Europe, we don't really have a great deal of information on how infantry was trained, but considering what they were capable of doing on the field, we kind of know quite easily that they were trained in some form. And again, here we're talking about the first millennium BC China. So the possibility of having an information is ever less there, considering Chinese mindset and just the age we're talking about. Wu Qi's legacy was also important for the further military development of Chinese warfare. In fact, these were the first instances of a regulation being issued regarding even just the armament of soldiers in a more comprehensive way. The short men were armed with long spears or halberd, while the tall men with bow or crossbow. And the fact that we're talking also about a crossbow tells us that it had not to do just with the fact that long bowmen were just the taller people in any culture, in any society. Here may have had to do with allowing overhead fire, which would stress, in fact, the further integration of infantry and missile at the same time. And it wouldn't be so strange, again, that even some infantry wings would have the pikemen in the front and the missile in the rear, right? The strongest men carried banners and flags, and this is normal, right? These were the standard bearers. Standards were sacred, and only the best troops, and there were probably some kind of NCO career within them in the same way, like in the Roman army, but for everybody. Also, the valiant carried the bells and drums that were used to properly evoke the divinity. And there is evidence of drums of important size in especially the later Zhou and the Qin eras that suggests, in fact, how important drills really were. I mean, we have forgotten in the West how common this was even among us, right? How military music and religious music were all were together an experience, right? The drum is used to signal advance and retreat. It also has bells that have something magic there, in gongs. Some of these coming from the steppes, as there's the broader legacy of the barbarians is still somewhat China was drawing its warfare from. And the drum was often also smeared with the prisoners' blood as a sacrifice for invoking divine aid, right? Naturally, sacrifices here were as important as in the West, albeit Confucians at the end of the period began to grow skeptical about the importance of the same. And we know what kind of orders were issued and how, right? Precise movements and order were beaten out on the drums and signaled by the bells in very complicated fashion. We have just a simpler idea of this with the by the number of drum beat, right? One would be weapons in order, that is fall in. 2 beats would be practice formation, that is close order drill. 3 beats would be the mass call. 4 beats prepare for action, and 5 advance, right? While bells ringing would signal stop, the halt. And drill was naturally taught. The Zhou were able to form square and circle defensive formations, maneuver in line and file, open and close ranks, and extend and close files, which is, pretty standard pack for any well-trained army capable of performing important maneuvers altogether. We know, I'd say it's difficult to resume what Zhou tactics were, because again we're talking about 800 years of warfare. There is, of course, an evolution. The earlier Zhous would be concerned even just about having troops capable of maintaining alignment where advancing. It's like saying the earlier Hellenic phalanx, right? It was a simple system. The most important thing was remaining cohesive during the advance, the march, and great part of the problem was just about that. Later on, there are much more complex maneuvers that entail, first of all, you see, the greater vassals were meant to provide three armies, so-called, that would perhaps be better translated like battles, meaning that very often the standard Zhou army would be something like this central body with two wings. There are not the aforementioned wings of the chariots and the infantry. Those would be at a smaller level, maybe within the same battles. It not necessarily in this case, because we don't know at that point how the wings also would have interacted. But in the smaller feudatories would have to, smaller vassals would have had to send just one of this. And these battles, however, were considered as a kind of tribute in military service that the vassals owed to the sovereign. And we have, however, information that in battles, these battles would be more. We have instances of 5 of them at a point. We have one battle in which 3 battles kept the enemy pinned while a 4th was outflanking it. So important collective maneuvers, right, by single armies that surely are about a very large amount of men. This would be the same thing. There are many battles that show how speed was fundamental. This is also what Sun Tzu in many ways says. So always catching the enemy by surprise while he was not prepared. But this is pretty universal in all warfare. It was stressed in many situations all over the world in every culture. There are kind of greater also tactical subtleties, like how the enemy would cope against the so-called barbarians. There are instances in which, for example, we know that there was less infantry in some contexts, especially in the frontier and mountainous warfare. At some point, the chariots dismounted, or also we know that there was the charioteers dismounted to provide other infantry. We know that these barbarians of the steppes had less order, right? The Zhou warfare, by the way, has an enormous history of the walls, the famous Chinese walls that began. Eventually, in later times, there would be an internal elimination of them. But during the warring state periods, every state was kind of walled by some, with some greater earthwork, etc., to stop the enemy. Also, this waves of nomads from the west. And there's all an evolution there that also really reminds quite easily the one in the west. Initially, it was just earth ramparts that were kind of thickened by just hammering on them. Towers began to appear, and something ever more complex and sophisticated was built with stone walls, etc. There was chemical warfare. There was mustard burnt and insufflated into the tunnels that the enemies were digging under the fortification. Like this kind of things, again, are pretty universal. There were counterweight throwing machines mounted on the walls, activated by pulleys, etc. So an important degree of military development. You can get also a bit more in depth with that probably in another video, right? The idea is it's sort of a bulimia of troops, especially in the latter period, where there seems to be this obsession for ever larger armies that were naturally very costly, and this also obliged that this speaks, let's say, of the vital struggle that occurred between these various states that were trying to knock each other out all the time. So they would invade en masse, also hoping properly to wipe out the enemy contendant. And at that point, let's say, the larger the army, the larger the disorder. So maybe this is why this great emphasis also on speed of catching the enemy unprepared and kind of letting them, fucking themselves up so that you can't simply take advantage of that. Maybe a bit of Sun Tzu's optimism regarding what, you can't do with an army derives from that, right? This avoidal of warfare that has no sense in Clausewitzian terms. It's against any scientific and moral evidence of warfare. But again, we have to understand that specifically. And also, again, considering that chariots and the horses had an enormous logistical cost, right? So you can't really mess around with these armies. You have to direct them really knowing what you have to do with them. You can't waste too much, because still these are, you can't say, oh wow, China, look at how many troops, etc. But the costs were enormous, not differently from the one we had in the West. So again, we are amazed out by this 800 years, warfare notions concentrated. But again, everything was much more normal and habitual, we probably would think, also for later times. Looking at the troops typologies that maybe show us something more technical and to understand also better the changes in the various arms, starting from the war chariot, right, the heavier type. So there are various examples also from later times. There are, for example, some Han Dynasty Wu family shrines that show the prototype of the Chinese war chariot altogether. Things didn't change enormously, right? The Han, also in terms of military designs, in many ways. Think about, the hood-shaped styles of the later Han Dynasty, were sometimes metal copies of older leather versions. It's like saying the famous so-called lorica segmentata of Roman times. The segmented armor existed since millennia, right? It's not that the Romans invented that. It's just that when you have a larger empire like the Han or the Roman one that really accumulates an unprecedented amount of wealth and power, that thing has the assets also for massing producing things on a much larger scale. This is interesting properly about chariot warfare in the Zhou era, because paradoxically, even though, especially during the time of the warring states, China produced an unprecedented amount of chariots, still we have less archaeological evidence of them, probably because most of them were now steadily built, and so they weren't connected to the ancient, lordly aristocratic funerary practice that would bury everything, etc. It would kind of save them also because they were very important assets. This is a bit just like it happens in the West when you look at, Egypt or this other, the very few powers that had the possibility of having a real administration that could maintain the stables, for producing these chariots, qualified personnel on large scale, right? So they wouldn't really bury those because they were public in a way. Indeed, this necessarily means that also when the chariot was employed in a more functional way on a larger scale, it was also less documented for us. And so this teaches you how not everything is directly proportional, in terms of evidence in production in history. And the Zhou version would be quite similar to the Han chariot type, yet without canopy, that in fact started appearing after the Zhous. And the vehicle's fighting compartment was approximately square, whereas in the previous times when the chariots were lighter, say in Shang times, they had just two horses. The side-to-side to front-back ratio was 3:2, probably because they were in fact lighter, more agile, and they needed they were less bulky and properly not designed to smash into the enemy, whereas a square platform is there to have a better distributed balance and not to fall because of impact. This is something that you see, in fact, also in our times, passing from the Bronze to the Iron Age chariot. That shows something along that pattern, which is definitely quite interesting. Of course, as we've seen, also the Zeus had, however, light chariots, mostly for skirmishing, etc. So that required simply more athletic capacities to remain standing on the chariot. We've made a video last autumn also about the Iron Age Celtic chariot. We've seen what kind of stunts the warriors were habituated of doing. So naturally, the more warfare secularizes and modernizes, the more things become, again, ever more interforce kind of functionalized, and chariots in this sense become ever more like the thing you want to throw into the enemy infantry in a much more, mediated and orderly way. Right, it's like heavier cavalry. We really need to find the right moment to launch it in, whereas skirmishers, you can't go back and forth. It's like what the Chinese thought about the barbarians, right? That they had no order, right? Because they were lighter, and so they would make much less charges than them, at least considering that those were mounted, whereas the Chinese prefer still chariots with which to defeat the same horsemen of the steppes. And beginning in the Zhou period and thereafter, the crew of the Chinese chariot consisted of a spearman on the right side, preferably an archer on the left, and a driver in the middle. And it seems that noblemen could be either three of the guys, because preferably he would be kind of the melee trooper, but so it could be the driver as well, it could be the shooter as well. And of course, who fought on a chariot normally was by default skilled in doing all three things altogether. But of course, a certain functionalization could still happen. Now, weapons, of course, were used on chariots. The Zhou used on chariots spears of two sizes that seemingly were enormously different. Something like almost 1.8 meters, and the other 7.2, which is crazy if you think about it, because especially the latter is something you have to control the oscillations on chariot. It's terrifying, but this means probably that was an incredibly and ferociously specialized type of chariot fighting, right? And of course, the distance is considered, it's like lances of knights, right? They want to reach the enemy, smashing during the charge. This really shows, again, how bulky and how more like knightly, impacting oriented the type of Chinese chariot warfare was compared to our Bronze Age, probably. Naturally, was composite bow used. We will see it better now. We're talking about archers specifically. Also, crossbows could be carried. At least we have evidence for the later hand type, as well as other, lances that probably kind of standardized in later times. So it would be interesting to know the two aforementioned ones, how they were used this differently. Probably the first one, the shorter one, could also be lance, properly thrown, And the Zhou chariot was without canopy. Had its sides covered with wooden boards or bucklers as a defense against arrows. Normally, as we will see now, armor was not always particularly heavy, right? In any case, it could be, but the average one wouldn't be. Like the cost was enormous, even for heavier metal armor. So you can understand it. Just an elite of it would have it, just like in medieval Europe. Just especially the horses. None of them practically until the 13th century was covered in metal, entirely like the horsemen, and just a very few of them would later on, and it was an increased distinction. So we don't know even too much about the various difference in size of the various types. We mostly talk about the heavier, the light chariot, but probably there were many different types. Standardization probably wasn't really there, or even if it was, by settled administration, it wasn't really everything you could see in the battlefield, especially in areas of China that changed wildly in terms of political and social divide, etc. And inside of the chariot would be mats of bamboo or embroidered carpets. There was, as we'll see now, an incredible heterogeneity, especially in the embellishment, right, to distinguish the vehicles on the field. It was, again, as medieval knights, everybody was colored in different ways. They had different symbols, it was a spectacle, really. We see in some artistic depictions green silk covering axle trees, quadrigas having golden bits with little bells on each side, in that case, especially the top nobility, with richly embroidered reins, etc. Very rarely horses were covered with brigandine or protected by bucklers themselves, right? Also consider the weight for the poor animals to pull and everything. And in fact, consider the central point here. We're talking about quadrigas that are typical, rather, of in the West, of the very late, almost dying chariot warfare, like or even if properly known in open field. So this tells you how bulkier properly the Chinese chariots were compared to the Western ones, to be habitually in warfare pulled by 4 horses. So even just the costs of a single chariot, as you understand, were much greater for the horses alone, that could bring a much greater weight, and still, however, no more men than in the West. So again, the meaning there is the chariot itself that is different in function. It is heavier, has to smash much more thoroughly, right, against something that is other chariots or infantry at the same time. So it's really tough. It's really intense chariot warfare. Chariot unit commanders also had particular standards, normally an oxtail affixed to the pole, signifying their command. We're talking about essentially a spear with a yak tail attached on the top. And for the rest, army standards and unit flags were quite common, adding to the colorfulness of that all. There a psychological effect to achieve as well. Ornaments, but this was also just for a matter of status, with little bells and ribbons, with figures of birds, serpents, etc. The imperial standard portrayed the sacred dragon, normally, but properly did. And there were other animals often attached to other parts of the army. For example, in an instance we know, the left wing of the army bore the green dragon standard, the right wing a white tiger, the vanguard a red phoenix, the rear guard a black tortoise, and the army commander was located by the so-called Great Bear standard, which is quite fascinating, because it already tells you, from even looking at the Zoo art, how still very unsecularized this context were, and how much of that sense of aggressive, warrioristic, and probably something there was about the embodiment of the beast warrior, etc., was there behind these concepts. And it was extremely important to make a lot of noise. As we've seen, there were the great drums that were mostly used for lining up the troops together. The drum is mostly for, this trance, is the chthonic element, right? That kind of hypnotizes the infantry and sends them to hell, right? Literally in combat. Whereas the bells that we see here prominently on the chariots themselves are the most hitting moment, the one of the charge, right? And this is in military music, everybody knows this, that is the celestial, the going not to hell but to heaven in combat, right? So these are radically universal and unchangeable meanings in all the history of mankind, and continue still today, even if people have completely lost any awareness of the fact that we live every day with the same meaning, the same symbols as well. And albeit chariot warfare declined, as we've seen, because of the effectiveness of the crossbow, probably a greater generalized strengthening of infantry, it's not before the 2nd century BC that the chariot effectiveness as a shock weapon is significantly reduced through the use of caltrops. And this is interesting because it's still, again, a somewhat late time. In the West, we were doing something similar. Like this time, I don't know, also cataphracts were being hampered by caltrops later on, at least by Sulla. The Seleucids were using the last heavy chariots probably around this time. So maybe the world was coming together, globalization was always there, and civilizations began to parallel each other's developments in an ever closer chronological fashion. But for the rest, the importance of chariot warfare, again, up to this point, had been really great, right, and greater than in the West. Again, probably because it was already a much more kind of feudal-like system, like in Europe wasn't there, because in Europe we were kind of all still like tribes essentially, right? And just a few states in Mediterranean and the Near East were kind of more advanced, more standardized fashion. So differences in this regard are very important civilizationally. And we see towards the end of the period, in fact, a compaction, let's say a technological improvement, probably with chariots, that in a sense were making them more compact, not necessarily larger, but more compact, suggesting that it was probably a greater pressure from the external that needed also probably the stability of the structure to hold more, probably because of an increasing shock impact, probably against infantry, was my guess there. And for the rest, the previous light type, or the one that remained lightly used for skirmishes, etc., probably, as we've seen, it entailed a bit more of agility from the side of the crew. There was, again, just 2 guys. But it seems that it was made up by a U-shaped bar traversing the vehicle from side to side that the charioteer grasped. Right, and it's possible the charioteer occupied the area in front of the bar, sitting as he drove the 2-horse chariot team, so leaving more room for the warrior who wielded his bow in combat. And this would be so strange because, for example, in Celtic warfare, we're told by the Romans that the Celtic warriors mounted on the axles, for example, sometimes to dismount in the front, at least in that case. But they could perform the stunts on the chariot, so we probably have to understand that this was normal, right? That everybody who fought on a chariot, whichever it was, could do the worst things on it just by training. Because again, especially the guys who went on chariot were hell of guys, were the equivalent of knights, so the equivalent of people who spent their entire life in combat, and so also with an important physical aptness, and they knew whatever they could do on a chariot. And just, a battle is where things really get crazy in combat, and really you're pressured to do things in order to save your life or to put an end to the other, as one that will bring you to perform such stunts. Now, passing to infantry and cavalry, as we've seen also for the later period, and the latter especially, starting from archery, because again, it seems to me that this was probably, and not differently from, say, the medieval West especially, and probably also even, classical Hellenic warfare, we see in art slingers and bowmen everywhere, but the stories just talk about the phalangite, right? The heavy infantrymen. So here it's probably the same. As we've seen in the Shang period, archers were probably the most common type of trooper. Probably in the Zhou time, the importance of infantry rose, and light infantry cannot hold the ground against the heavier one. So light and heavy here, it's not how armored they are, but how much they can keep fighting against an enemy on a in a compact formation, right? Which is relative depending on the enemy, of course, but meaning that between infantries, that's the divide normally between the skirmishers and the melee, the stopping infantry is calling in this way. And we do have evidence in late Zhou times. There are also figures in vessels, etc., of an archer properly. And we think that missile troops compose just a small portion of the army. But how few, we have no idea. And especially considering that crossbows come around this time, the question is, we have, again, also in medieval warfare, like crossbowmen were not that many, but they were enough. Like even compared to we often attribute to the longbow in late medieval times. The longbow, right? The longbow was present in atrociously large amount of troops compared to crossbowmen on a regular basis, right? Disproportionately, like even 1 to 10 or something like that. So this doesn't actually mean that even crossbows there couldn't represent an important firepower, that even though there were fewer troops, they were actually more effective than we think, right? And it could be even picked one. We have seen at the Battle of Maling how crucial they had been, especially, on mountain passes. You increase also the projectile power by gravity acceleration, but still they can be used, as we've seen, that kind of collective and likely semi-professional fashion at least. We don't know about uniforms in the Zhou. Probably that there was something in common there. Probably it's not these were systems that would have enough to spend just for these things. They would recognize each other different ways, as uniforms even in contemporary industrial times do not exist after a few months of campaign physically, but we have an idea, at least instead, of how the weapons were, because bows were fundamentally the composite recurved one, right? It was made of strips of bamboo glued or bound together with silk, and averaging 4 feet in length. Naturally, the degree of ornament could show your status. The commander's one would have been orned with ivory, for example. There were surely other colors around. We see, as we've seen, silk, where this often was green, but some bows and arrows were painted red. Red, vermilion were also in general the kind of not standard, but generally speaking, the most common type of color out there. I don't know, under the honey would be yellow instead. These are common colors for military purpose and properly embodying the imperial universal divine power, right? Also, quivers were frequently covered with tiger skin. Lighter infantry could include also skirmishers, with javelins 1.2, 1.5 meters in length, and also small buckler. The javelin name would be Mao. The javelin was important in general against armored close range, right? It's also during sieges. Normally, you find that as claiming victims against armor, too, mostly in the open areas between the joints. Speaking of the crossbows, as we were saying before, we will add something also later. At the Battle of Maling, these troops have said to have been to have virtually annihilated the Wei by making use of all this missile force. And probably this, say, some infantry was also equipped with both, like kind of melee and missile troops in certain cases, especially in those, I don't know, the guard troops or some of the kind of professional, semi-professional bodies. Let's call them this way. Even though functionalization, it is probably in kind of the middle period, whereas functionalization would make it more separated over time, of course. So it's even more, it's more likely thus in the beginning, rather. Speaking of infantry, instead, what is interesting in this period is that the Chinese wore, apparently in combat, also a long flowing robe that would be substituted later, also as we will see, for mostly from cavalry fashion, from the steppes, but something more practical. But this probably shows again the greater staticity of the archaic combat, where probably infantry was less involved in direct confrontation while the chariots fought, right? Whereas where everything got more functionalized between the various arms later in interacting, also something more practical for movement would appear. This clothes had some practical purpose, however, as they were padded with layers of cloth, likely at least to provide a minimal protection. And we know that by the time of the Qin, some corselets of treated animal hide were worn over this robe. And this infantry would be the one typically equipped en masse with the so-called Dagger Axe, at least sometimes referred to as Ko, which was a very interesting weapon existing since Shang time, where it was at the beginning quite primitive, just consisting of a blade mounted at right angles to a 3 to 6 foot shaft, and usually one-handed together with a shield. In Zhou times, however, this thing was extended down the haft to give an effective cutting edge, and the shaft itself had an asymmetrical cross-section to stop it twisting in the hand. This is the moment in which also Chariot is further developed, so this speaks probably of this infantry power increasing also in an anti-Chariot fashion. In later times, say time of the Warring States, the Dagger Axe continued to evolve, so that by the end of the 4th century, the addition of a spear blade to the end of the shaft had turned into a true cut and thrust weapon, or the halberd. So it had a cutting, piercing, thrusting, and breaking force, and so it required also an important degree of training, which again suggests, just like again in late medieval Europe, that this thing was in the hands of ever better drilled infantrymen. And the call was made of bronze. It varied, as we've seen, in length. Often typically could be from 2.7 to 5.4 length, which is important. Is a lot, right? Even the Macedonian sarissa was 5.4. It was something different. I'm not comparing them, because that was a phalanx, just a pike, like a hedgehog in a sense. The call was for a more active, say, fencing even in a shorter range normally, as we see, because the 5.4 meters for the sarissa, or right around there, is the minimum that we think it could be long. But okay, maybe even less. Sometimes we think that this was extra long, but it's just because it was mistranslated in the unit of measure. It was not like the 8 meters long thing. But as we've seen, that also existed. We will see it later, as some heavy infantry of the Marquis of Benove was given even a 7.3 long pike, or halberd properly. So that is incredible too, because it again, for the swings, that's terrifying. You must be very, very, very well trained and very capable, right, to avoid mishandling it also, and especially in a formation that at that point maybe was becoming like the 15th century was, like, not very refined. It was more the mass and the collective effort that made the difference. The fencing was very simple after all. But the fact it was not a pike, but again, the halberd, we can't say by this time, is ever more interesting, because I don't know in Europe anything of that kind. And there were naturally different shapes of the blade. Here I've put a lot of pictures, as you've seen about it. You see it as the main weapon. The infantry of the Zhou period relied entirely on the bow for missile support in general. Javelins carried were not hand-hurled, but rather used for close combat, which makes sense. Also, they could be thrown from chariot, probably, as it was done also in the West. And it's obvious that the bow would be kind of more handy. But I think the skirmishers with javelins were there as well. It's just we may see them less. Probably because, just like in the European Middle Ages, there was, let's say, armies were a bit more compact in a way. And so probably later on, the more compact they became, also the more the masses were demilitarized. And so like in Europe, you see skirmishers and slingers kind of contracting, disappearing. That may be a reason why we see mostly the bow that effectively substitute the skirmishers, like in the Middle Latin sources, the crossbowmen are often called bellites because they equated, like they had substituted the missile element of the, at least of the light infantry, compared to the Roman model, let's say. Speaking of heavy infantry, this was just an elite, but still the core of the footmen, and it would also probably be the prototype of the armored chariot warrior. As we've seen, the same noblemen were meant to fight on foot at a point. Even when chariot warfare began to decline, they thought that going on horseback was barbarian-like, and they didn't like it very much. Some also kept fighting on foot. The armor would be lacquered leather or some form of brigandine, right? And the type of armor in this regard was a bit distinctive in Zhou times. The rituals of Zhou, for example, describe the guidelines for the palace armors. There was one type of armor known as kia. It was sleeveless. It was a sleeveless coat of rhinos or buffalo hide, formed on a wooden dummy, while another one was known as the kiai, and consisted of leather scales on a fabric backing, right? And this was used for corselets and armor trappers, also for the chariot horses, which were also protected by tiger skins sometimes. And you understand that overall the degree of armoredness was not particularly high. It's said that crossbows were very effective at close range, in fact, against this type of armor, and also against the horses, as you understand, as the armor was rare. A heavier one was rare for them, especially in the first place, because it was extremely costly. Speaking of helmets, we have often these types of headpiece shown, and the Zhou ones were in bronze, similar to the Shang types, but less elaborately decorated, probably speaking of that kind of standardization, uniformation, but also cheapification. It's like the Pilos type or the Montefortino type, right? Initially, it was the time of the warriors, and at least the best ones has this incredibly elaborated helmets, etc. Then eventually there are ever more helmets produced for the masses, and they're kind of more relatively standardized, and so you have this type one. And as we were saying before, this would influence further also the hand types of helmets, which is quite interesting, because if you compare to what was happening in the West, more or less the helmet's typologies, they had the similar chronological evolution. Zhou princes would have red silk plume adorning their helmet, right, as part of that aforementioned kind of sacred superior color. But you see the Spartans, the Romans, ideally we think red, because of the color of blood in general, had this prevalence apparently, even though it was not really good. Everything was much more colorful than we know. As you know, there is no single proof of color uniformity in a standardized fashion for the entire thing. And just the feudal differences would add further the variety. Speaking of the aforementioned infantry of the Marquis Venovet around 387 BC, well, these wore lacquered hide armor reinforced with rhino horn plates, as we were remembering before, and seemingly they were better equipped exactly in this context. The shields painted in the aforementioned vermilion but also blue, and carrying this incredibly long pikes, which again, I actually have to correct myself, they were pikes. They were known as the Mao, the one 7.3 meters long. And so it does make sense, because I had never heard the military history of such a long halberd. While the ones that were, the halberds were 3.6 meters long or something like that. This is, again, very similar to some of the highest moments, however, of infantry functionalization in history. I mean, pikes of 7 meters long reminds definitely the Swiss times, and also the halberds with their specialization at the same time, like 15th century infantry. Not that they really were, because of course lots of things were. Like, it's not to say that China was more advanced in absolute terms, but in relative terms, for the times, right, it was, right, the degree of infantry functionalization, again, is not to be seen elsewhere. You know how different ancient infantry was in the West. It was something much more, if you want, kind of still barbaric in a sense, right, but not barbaric in a simply less functionalized in a subtle sense, and with degree of also of political and social segmentation. The Hellenic and Roman infantry we see them as states, but it's the exact opposite. They descend mostly from this Indo-European warlike background, and they were conceptually warriors. Except, okay, the Greeks would think otherwise of their own hoplites, but still the ethos that they had as individual citizens and freemen, it was completely unknown there in China in the same ways. And so it was a compromise, right? 15th century infantry was superior, if anything, also just aside from the fact that the infantry would be integrated with other artillery, with heavier cavalry, but also think about the materiel. Here, smelting iron doesn't become a thing up to before the 2nd century BC, right? So there was also a buckler of lacquered leather or varnished rhino hide completing this set we just described for the average infantry, though. And there is also some sword coming around for the average infantryman, together with the battle axe. The normal axe was present as well. It was known as Yue, and it was just not as common as the Dagger Axe, but it was still there. And swords start coming about that are very similar to the Roman gladius, by the way. And even though they're conceptually different, because they evolve properly from daggers, as far as I understand, whereas the Roman gladius evolved essentially from the overlapping of the Latin Celtic swords and the Iberian falcata. But the result is the same, and probably speaks for the degree of compactness that some of these infantry, especially in the later Zhou period, had achieved, right? And that's really terrifying. That they're very well balanced swords for both cutting and thrusting, just like the gladius was. Contrarily wise to the common stereotype, it was just for thrusting. Absolutely not. The gladius is a hell of a cutter, and it always was throughout all its modifications, leaving aside the fact that it always was used next to the Latin type of what would become the spada later, throughout all the entire period, right? And this is still often overlooked, even in Republican, late Republican, early Imperial times. Speaking of more elite bodies of for example, the Corps Elite Guards, right? This every state had its own kind of little empire after all. They wore leather armor, bronze helmet. This is just an example. A sword, a crossbow, as we were saying before, double arm side weapon, also as a crossbow. That is similar also to, again, the ideal knight in medieval times, that contrarily to the common prejudice, even there they were perfectly skilled in using crossbows and bows on horseback and in combat in general, not just as swordsmen. And again, here, remember the prejudices, the literary prejudices, for which we don't know what reality was, and you have to check archaeology and other things. But even just using common sense, they did use it even in the times of chivalry, right? And a quiver of, in fact, of 15 bolts for the bow, right? The crossbow there is really something. As we've seen, it starts appearing in the 6th century, which is around the same time in which as the sword and shield surpassed bow and halberd for the common man, right? Which is even more interesting because, as I was saying before, it's as if, in spite of the further development of infantry in the second half of the first millennium BC, it was also the one of cavalry and of the elite in general. So that the full knight, let's say with longer swords, were also kind of impressively long and well suited for mounted combat, start surpassing, by common feeling about it, the average type of warrior that had existed before, especially in combination with sword and shield, right? And the sources are pretty clear about this. So this is really something, right? And the crossbow there is exactly probably this evolution that exists in Europe in the same way. You see, crossbows evolved in the 12th to 13th century, were the same centuries in which the heavy knight was essentially reaching his peak. So this is a bit the same way, like in China. As far as the bow release type, this was the typically oriental one that would remain in Persia, India, Turkey, right? The idea of having the thumb as the strongest single digit, providing the pull with an archer's ring worn on it as a protection from bowstring pressure and friction, right? In fact, in the European release, you have 3 or 4 fingers that make pressure spread the pressure over a greater surface, right? And instead, the ring essentially allows to bring pressure to be on a single point of the string close to the nock, right? And this is, in a sense, probably for increasing also the precision of the composite bow that had a longer reach than the Western one, so that would speak for it. And you know that in general, the Eastern military cultures were more fixated in a sense with the bow, also in mythology, etc., than the West. It was kind of always about the sword in a sense, or the spear alternatively. Not that there wasn't something like this in the East as well, but the bow looms a bit more, right, in China, because of this also longer and constant connection with the barbarians. Okay, also in Europe we were with the steppes, etc., but also in Japan, in Korea, you have this idea of the bow that has a greater role, whereas in the West it becomes everything more, swordized, and the bow is the weapon of the disloyal, just as for the Hellenic hoplite that doesn't talk about, those filthy non-citizens, because who are they, right? Even though the concept is much more connected to the warrior ideal, still, because, okay, this is complex, but I will not digress because it's Hellenic warfare, we're not talking about that, but so it is. I would conclude this video by talking about the later Zhou, and that is also kind of Qin cavalry that wasn't particularly heavy, because it began to become consistently strong over time, of course, but it emerges from this chariot dominance, right? When the Shaanxi province adopted the dress and tactics of their traditional enemies, the Xiongnu. This occurred traditionally under the reign of Wu Ling between 225 and 298 BC. It naturally speaks of a much older influence. Again, there are Chinese, even the same Shanks, honestly, were a pastoral people initially. And again, it seems that this meeting, it's a bit like in the West, right? We underestimate how European civilization emerged properly from the fact that we are a mix between this, the nomadic steppe and the sedentary world, but if we have eliminated from our memory the earlier, right? But that's the sap of Westernness in many ways. So a bit the Chinese were stimulated in the same way, right? And just at this time, evidently, things were ready within China for the adoption of this external military style. Of course, cavalry has a history. Also, the steppes have an evolution of cavalry, and at this point, the combined arms require the extension of empires and their strategic projection, etc., require ever more flexible armies, and so cavalry is irrenounceable. It's a bit like what happens to the Greeks during the Peloponnesian War, right? They need troops that can fight somewhere else on difficult terrain where the phalanx cannot reach. The Chinese had already shown good adaptability, as we were saying before, even on more difficult grounds, and probably Chinese armies were much more different than we think among each other in terms of cultural influences or types of fighting, right? We can't really properly say, again, what's Chinese and what's barbarian sometimes across this huge frontier. So the aforementioned long robes and slippers, typical of the Chinese troops, were replaced by the more sensible trousers and soft leather boots, right? They were very practical for mounted fighting. Long swords start coming around, also possibly a small buckler, plus a bow, right? So even here, China acquires the multitask trooper, like a bit in the West keeps happening, I don't know, with the Byzantines that are more exposed to the steppes and train atrociously long their own troops to use multiple weapons at a time. And very often, of course, these people are the same barbarians that are settled in the territory, right? So you can't really even distinguish them. There are interesting figures in Chinese art also showing firing left-handed. You can imagine all the various combinations that occurred at this point in cavalry development, fighting styles, and so on in China. It's mostly during the Qin era and its militarism that cavalry, however, is fully functionalized for Chinese tactics. So we will see this when talking about the Qin because it's kind of more interesting. But cavalry still played little part in the army until then. It's in fact arguably because of this steppe tactics that the Qin, okay, not because of that literally, but through that they managed to defeat the previous establishment and create an empire on their own, right? And these are all things that we will hopefully see at some point better. There would be, believe me, an enormity of things to say about this Zhou warfare, and at least I'm glad that we began doing it, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.